My guest is Michelle Miller. She's Senior Procurement Analyst and also Team Lead for the Procurement Support Directorate of the Army. Michelle, good to have you with us.
Thank you.
And your topic at MCA today is how to build a protest-proof procurement and solicitation.
Well, let me caveat. There is no such thing as protest-proof, so it is on best practices to avoid bid protests. So there are things you can do to attempt to avoid, but there's nothing is protest-proof.
Got it. Well, with that caveat, let's talk about scope here, because roughly there's about 2,100 protests every year out of hundreds of thousands of contract actions.
Correct.
So it's a small number, but I guess it has an inordinate effect on things, doesn't it?
Well, I mean, it has a huge effect if you happen to be the one who gets the protest. It can literally take over all of a contracting officer's time dealing with a protest that could be spent doing other things. It can have a huge impact. But the other impact that is a little off to the side of that is we keep receiving on the government side, and industry keeps finding the need to protest on their side, the same things over and over and over again. Not always. There are things that are, a case that is a first impression, but frequently we find very similar protest grounds over and over again. And so a lot of the tips that I am trying to give people for avoiding bid protests are really focused on how do we work better as government to find solutions so that we're not continually receiving the same types of protests over and over and over again throughout different agencies. So there's a lot to be said about, taking lessons learned from prior bid protests and applying them to what we're doing going forward. And as a government as a whole, we have not had a great track record with doing that across the board.
What are some of the grounds that you see over and over again for protests?
So we frequently see protests that deal with what is essentially a protest evaluation factor that was not actually stated in the solicitation. That's one that comes up frequently.
It might have occurred to the contracting officer later on.
So sometimes it's something that occurs to a contracting officer later on. Sometimes it's just taking an area further than intended. So we might say in a technical evaluation factor that we want to evaluate their technical approach so that they move supplies more quickly. Well, they might say, I can move supplies more quickly because I have a specific, certification to get things through certain shipping, processes more quickly.
Right.
And so this is one I had where my technical evaluation team, when I was a KO, wanted to award a strength for that. And I said, well, here's the problem. Our solicitation didn't say you have to have this. And we didn't give any information ahead of time to let other operators know that if they had that, they could also get a string. So while this company happened to put it in their proposal, and we think it's great, and it really is a benefit to the government, it met the definition of a string.
Right.
But we didn't tell them in the solicitation that we wanted it. So if we were to have given that string, and that were to have been something that another company found out, hey, this company got a string for this, they might come back and say, well, I'm protesting. I should have gotten a strength for that too. I didn't even know to include it in my proposal, but I have the same certification. So that type of thing can happen where you just inadvertently end up awarding what looks like a perfectly reasonable strength and meets all the definitions.
Right.
But it just wasn't stated as an evaluation factor per se.
Yeah, so the issue is that a strength could come up in a bid that you didn't know when you made the solicitation, and that's what happens from time to time.
Correct. And the same can happen with weaknesses. We try to encourage, careful selection of evaluation factors and factors that are actually a discriminator between, different proposals that will come in, because you don't want to choose evaluation factors that don't give you a discrimination between the different offerers. But sometimes we don't think of everything. So occasionally we find that we don't like a proposal for a reason that we can't then do anything about during the evaluation unless we were to go back and amend our own solicitation. We can't just give them a weakness because we don't like what they said and we realize after the fact, oh, this isn't something we want them to do. So those types of things, either you have to amend a solicitation or you have to deal with it in, post-award administration if you choose to award to them.
What is the expression? It's complicated. Exactly. All right. Yes. We're speaking with Michelle Miller. She's Senior Procurement Analyst and Team Lead for the Procurement Support Directorate of the Army. And Smokey Bear is walking by us from the National Park Service here. We'll say hi, Smokey. That's right, yeah. The only guy here without a shirt on. Come on, Smokey, you gotta get better garb on than that. Nice hat, though. But getting back to procurement on the Army side of things. So how do you write that into a solicitation to make it less prone to protest if you don't know what the strength or weakness coming through later is going to be?
So a huge part of what I'm encouraging people to do and what I'm presenting here is really about talking to industry. And NCMA is, we're all here under the theme of collaboration. So, that's how I ended up speaking at this particular conference on this particular topic is, my ideas on collaboration. When I talked to someone at NCMA, they said, hey, we really like you to tell everybody else that they need to do that. Because if government and industry are talking to each other prior to the release of a solicitation, if they're doing industry days, if they're putting out a draft RFP and looking for honest feedback, or even a draft PWS if you don't have a full RFP, if you're looking for feedback and industry is providing feedback, and not just an RFI where we ask a set of questions and they get to respond only to those, but actually opening it up and saying, hey, here's what we think our solicitation is going to say. Give us your questions, and then we take the time to really read and actually respond to those questions, and if needed, adjust the solicitation. A lot of times we can find out before we ever put a solicitation on the street that industry reads what we thought said one thing to say something else, or industry will tell us, hey, if you tell us this is your requirement, we're going to propose to do X, Y, and Z. Well, we may realize we like X and Z, but we don't like Y. And then we need to make that clear to them in the solicitation in some way that we don't want that. If we don't do that communication up front and we're not talking between government and industry, and we haven't done adequate market research, and we haven't learned enough to understand from best practices of prior solicitations, then that goes back to what I was talking about earlier, where we all, can continue as a government as a whole to make the same errors over and over again. And if you're not doing that, you're likely to end up with a problem like we just discussed, where there's something in the proposal you don't like that you might have been able to find out ahead of time. You could have just written the solicitation to avoid that problem.
So then your market research should include that whole activity, that whole discussion.
And it's a little beyond typical market research. Typical market research, we go out, we kind of figure out what the market says and whatever. This is going a step beyond and really engaging with industry to make sure that not only did you do the market research, but that whatever you found and whatever you think you're putting into your requirement actually fits with what's really going on in industry. And some industries change really quickly. So, just because you did the market research and you think you understand, you may put out a draft RFP solicitation and find that a couple months ago, after you finished your market research, while you were writing your requirement, that all of industry decided we're going this way with something, and they changed. So, it's really about getting deeper into that.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I guess a lot of people tend to be reluctant with talking that much because they think, well, in a solicitation, after it's out, then you can't communicate as much with industry.
Correct.
But there's that dividing line, and you got to understand what side of it you're on.
Well, and it's important to note that, if you're communicating with industry, you need to communicate with industry.
Everybody, right.
If you target specific companies, that's where people run into trouble. But if you are having a conversation with a specific company and then you put, something out to the rest of that industry and say, here are the conversations we've had with a few select companies, that can sometimes solve the problem. But yeah, you have to communicate with industry as a whole. You can't play favorites. You can't, target specific contractors or only talk to them. But before the solicitations on the street, you can, if you do it properly, communicate with industry and get a lot of feedback on these areas that can drastically improve your solicitation and your outcomes. I awarded a nearly $10 billion IDIQ years ago that we didn't receive a single post-award protest on, and we only received, out of that entire process that took nearly 2 years, we had one pre-award protest, and that was essentially an unavoidable topic where half the offers wanted it one way, the other half wanted it another way, and there was no reconciling the feedback we got from industry, so we had to, pick the one that made the most sense for the government. Fortunately, GAO agreed with my approach, so we ended up not having that sustained, but...
Well, you could have a job at GSA if you're not careful. And just briefly, tell us about the contract protest diagnostic tool.
So this is a tool. It's actually a really interesting story. If I can tell you a quick story. So I was in the GW Law procurement, government procurement law program doing a degree at the law school. And I took an acquisition policymaking class where we had to come up with a policy proposal. And knowing that a lot of contracting officers are not attorneys, and a lot of these quote-unquote rules in bid protest decisions that aren't stated in the FAR are hard for people to find, and that we get a lot of protests in areas that aren't specifically stated in the FAR, I thought, we really need something in government where we can easily find these piddly rules. And they're not rules, but GAO tends to follow their own precedent. So if you're the 21st KO to make the same decision that 20 others have done, and GAO has said the 20 others are wrong because, well, when you're the
Why be 21?
they're going to say the same thing. But if you're a KO, if one of the examples I love to use is price realism. We all think, when you read the language, the price should be reasonable and realistic. Well, that sounds great. I'll put that in my solicitation. You don't realize if you're a brand new KO and no one has ever told you before, and the FAR doesn't say price realism is a separate thing. It talks about cost realism, and there is a little portion that talks about price, but it doesn't come out to say, this is price realism and this is how it works, and you basically shouldn't do it unless you really, really need to. So they'll put that language in, and then they'll get a protest saying that they didn't do a realism evaluation on a fixed price commercial item. Well, they didn't realize they were putting anything in there, but at the same time, GAO has said over and over again, if you're going to include that realism language in there and say that you're going to determine that their prices are reasonable and realistic, that means you're going to do a realism analysis. So things like that tend to come up over and over again. And the problem is there's so many bid protest decisions, and it's all written in legalese, and it's very difficult for a KO to keep up with any of those. So
You say KO.
KO, I'm sorry, a contracting officer.
Okay, you don't say CO, you say KO.
Remy uses KO, sorry. I've tried to train myself to say CO, and I keep going back to KO. Sorry about that. But yeah, so a contracting officer can just stumble into these unsuspecting. So my policy pitch in this class was, we need a tool that translates GAO and Court of Federal Claims bid protest decisions into plain language that's searchable by key topic, by where you are in the FAR, by where you are in the solicitation process, that will allow people to find these decisions on things like price realism or key personnel or any of these areas that are kind of heavily protested that just aren't mentioned in the FAR. And so that was my proposal in January. In the middle of March, I found out that somebody had put out a tool that did basically my entire checklist of what a tool needs to do. So my policy proposal for the class changed drastically, and I met Pat Saracena and Pat Butler, and they were working on MITRE's version of the bid protest, the contract diagnostic tool. So I ended up talking to them and
they
realizing...
work for MITRE?
Yes, so Pat Saracena is the developer. He works for MITRE. Pat Butler is the attorney who's an independent consultant who works on the tool.
Right.
But I ended up meeting them and finding out that the original policy vision that was in my brain was what they had developed. And so since then, I've been working with them and, sitting in as they've done demos of this and trying to, get the word out within Army, at least, where I have influence, to get people to use this, because it does exactly fill that gap that is so huge within government. We just have this gap in knowledge that it's very difficult to fill. So
Now you've filled it.
It's a tool that basically fills that gap and allows a contracting officer to find plain language.
And the tool's available to anyone.
It is. It's available publicly. It's on a website.
Okay.
And you can go to that tool and you can use it. It was developed under government contract, so it's free to government, and government has rights in it. And
all right, we'll have a link to it.
Yes,
okay.
Absolutely.
Well, excellent. We've been speaking with Michelle Miller. She's Senior Procurement Analyst and Team Lead for the Procurement Support Directorate of the Army. Thanks so much.
Thank you.